Ever get that feeling like when you're reading about history, like maybe there's some stuff missing?
Hmm.
Well, you're right, and that's exactly what we're looking at today. We're doing a deep dive into some really overlooked parts of American history, particularly how we teach about slavery and the societies that were here even before colonization. And let me tell you, the stuff we found in these articles, these research papers, it's pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, it's really something.
We're talking about the state of slavery education today, a wild discovery about Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, the untold story of the Black Panther Party, and even like the complete erasure of the Taino people from, well, history.
Mm.
So get ready to like really think about whose stories get told and how that shapes our whole view of the past.
It's amazing how much our view of history, what we think we know, depends on what's, emphasized, what gets left out, even how things are presented. But today, we're going to put on our thinking caps and really dig into those overlooked parts of history.
Right, because it's like they say, history is written by the victors.
Right.
But maybe it's more like history is written by whoever controls the narrative, which is kind of what we're unpacking today.
Yeah, exactly.
So first up, let's talk about how slavery is taught in schools. One of the articles we have, it cites this like crazy statistic. Only 8% of high school seniors, they could identify slavery as the main cause of the Civil War.
Wow.
8%. It's like, how can you even start to understand the present if you don't get how huge a role slavery played in our past?
It shows you like a major problem with how slavery is often taught, It's treated as this isolated thing, just a chapter in the past, not a core part of American society and economics, which it really was.
And thinking about it, that limited understanding, it can have a domino effect, right?
Yeah.
If we don't really deal with the horrors of slavery, how deeply rooted it was, aren't we risking repeating those same mistakes, those same patterns of oppression, just in new ways?
Exactly. It's like imagine building a house on a cracked foundation.
Oh, okay.
You might not see the problems right away, but eventually they'll come out.
It's giving haunted house, but make it historical trauma.
Right.
And speaking of uncomfortable truths, this report from the Southern Poverty Law Center, it really gets into the nitty-gritty of teaching this subject. They found that teachers often feel uncomfortable with the topic. The standards in different states aren't good enough. And even the textbooks, they sometimes just kind of brush over how brutal slavery was and its lasting impact.
Yeah, it's easy to want to, clean up history, make it easier to digest, especially for the classroom. But doing that, it doesn't do justice to the truth, and it doesn't do justice to us.
Right. It's not about making anyone feel guilty or anything. It's about understanding the full weight of our history, the good, the bad, the absolutely horrible.
Exactly, and we can't do that if we're only getting a cleaned up, partial version of what happened. And the article, it brought up another really important point about how we focus too much on the white narratives during this time. Meanwhile, the many different experiences of enslaved people, they're often pushed aside.
It's like we're only getting half the story and not even the most important half. And it makes you think about like whose story gets told and how they tell it. Like in that article about MLK and Malcolm X. Get this. There's actually evidence that one of MLK's most famous criticisms of Malcolm X, the one about fiery demagogic oratory, might be totally made up.
Yeah, it's a wild discovery, and it really shows how much power even one misattributed quote can have. It can totally shape how we understand historical figures and how they were connected. This fabrication, people have been repeating it for decades. It's influenced how we see these two incredibly important civil rights leaders and how they felt about each other.
Right. You grow up with these stories, these ideas about historical figures that seem like solid facts. And then suddenly, bam, you find out something like this and it makes you question everything.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to always approach historical accounts with a bit of healthy skepticism,
Totally.
To ask ourselves whose voices are we hearing the loudest and whose voices are being silenced or maybe even twisted.
Exactly. And speaking of voices that are often twisted, let's talk about the Black Panther Party. This article did a good job showing how often people reduce them to just violence, which really doesn't do their whole story justice.
Totally agree. While the Black Panthers did support armed self-defense, especially against police brutality, you have to understand that stance came from a place of being constantly oppressed by the system.
Right, like if your community is always under attack,
Yeah.
wouldn't you feel like you had to defend yourself?
Exactly.
But that context, the WHY behind their actions, it's often left out of the textbook version of the story.
It is, and that's a problem because it gives you a skewed picture of their goals, what they were really about. This article highlighted how much the Black Panthers prioritized social programs, things like the Free Breakfast for Children program, healthcare initiatives, empowering the community. These weren't just people trying to cause chaos. They were organized activists, fighting for real change on multiple fronts.
And they were really committed to socialist ideas, right? Like believing that wealth redistribution was essential for fixing racial and economic injustice.
Exactly. Their commitment to those social programs, it all came from this belief, this idea that you can't have true equality if resources are so unevenly distributed. And honestly, you rarely hear that perspective in mainstream narratives about the Black Panthers.
It's like they become this caricature, this symbol of just being militant. And the nuances of their ideology, their dedication to social justice, it all gets lost. And then you add in the FBI's role in all of this, and it gets even more complicated. We know the FBI actively tried to sabotage and discredit the Black Panther Party, and their tactics were, let's just say questionable.
It was a targeted, systematic attempt to shut them down, completely fueled by fear and this idea that the Black Panthers were dangerous, a threat to how things were. It makes you wonder how we decide who gets to be a legitimate social movement and who gets labeled as dangerous or radical.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, how often does this kind of thing happen? How often are movements for social justice, especially those led by marginalized groups, misunderstood, misrepresented, and in the end, silenced?
Yeah, it's like we were saying before about history being written by whoever's in control of the story, right?
Right.
And for groups like the Black Panthers, that story, it can be so strong, it drowns out the reality of what they did, what their message was.
Absolutely. And sadly, their story isn't unique. Throughout history, even here in America, there are so many examples of entire groups of people being erased from the narrative completely. And that leads us to the last article, which looks at a group you might not have even heard of, the Taino people. They were the original inhabitants of the Caribbean.
I have to admit, I had never even heard of the Taino people before I read this article.
It's like, we all know about Columbus, but how many of us could name even one Taino leader or even describe their culture?
It's a sad but perfect example of what scholars call curricular genocide. It's the systematic removal of certain groups from what's taught in schools, which basically silences their stories, makes their contributions seem small, and in the end, keeps us from truly understanding history.
Curricular genocide. That's a powerful way to put it. And it's incredibly sad to think about all the stories, all the knowledge, the wisdom that's been lost because of it.
It is, and it's not like the information doesn't exist. The article actually used quotes from Columbus's own journals where he described the Taino people's homes, their canoes, how intricate they were, even praised their kindness, how generous they were.
Wow.
Just imagine, even when he encountered this completely different culture, he could still see their humanity, their worth.
Which makes the way the Spanish colonizers treated them even more horrific. We're talking enslavement, violence, disease, their population being decimated. It's awful. And to think, for centuries, their story has been ignored, downplayed, or completely wiped from our collective memory.
And that erasure, it has real consequences. It lets us continue harmful narratives, ignore the lasting impact of colonization, avoid facing the uncomfortable truths about our own past. But there's some good news. The article mentioned that there's a growing movement to revive the Taino language and traditions. Descendants of the Taino are reclaiming their history, making sure their story isn't lost forever.
That's amazing. It really shows the resilience of indigenous peoples, not just in the Caribbean, but all over the world. It gives me hope. It reminds me that even when faced with such huge loss and injustice, the human spirit, that desire to remember and be remembered, it can win out in the end.
It does, and it highlights something crucial about history itself. It's not fixed, it's not set in stone, it's a living, breathing narrative, constantly being shaped and reshaped as new voices are heard, as hidden truths are uncovered, and as we, who inherit this complex legacy, choose to engage with it in fresh and meaningful ways.
So as we finish up this deep dive, this look into the overlooked parts of American history, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from our conversation?
I think the most important thing to remember is this. History isn't just something we passively learn about, it's something we actively create. Through the questions we ask, the sources we look for, the stories we choose to lift up. Whose history matters? The answer is simple. Everyone's.
Perfectly said. And for those of you listening, don't stop asking questions. Keep seeking out those untold stories. And remember, you have a role to play in shaping a more inclusive, a more accurate understanding of our shared past. Because history isn't just something that happened, it's still happening right now.